Hello, class! Today we're going to discuss H.P. Lovecraft's solution to the paradox of horror. Here's some study guide questions to help us get started. 1. What is Lovecraft's solution to the paradox of horror? 2. What is the sublime, as opposed to the beautiful? 3. What are two common differences between sublime objects and the monsters of horror fiction? 4. What is the main objection to Lovecraft's account? Alright, as always, when I give the answers to these questions, you may want to pause the video to write them down, type them up, crochet them into a sweater, or hammer them into an ice sculpture, however it is that you best compartmentalize this information. So, H.P. Lovecraft was an author of horror fiction and one of the canonical designers of a certain intersection between science fiction and horror, often called cosmic horror. Many of Lovecraft's stories are about strange creatures from beyond the stars or from alien worlds, which challenge our sense of importance in the universe and maybe even the sciences that we thought we could use to chart it. Lovecraft wrote an essay called On the Supernatural in Literature, and in it he gives a little philosophy about what he thinks horror fiction amounts to. We're interested in this because, according to Noel Carroll, he provides a solution, or attempts to provide a solution, to the paradox of horror. Now, when we looked at the paradox of horror, we noted that it's an inconsistent triad. It says, on one hand, audiences enjoy horror fiction for its distinctive genre-defining characteristic, but also, that distinctive genre-defining characteristic is frightening and disgusting the audience, and audiences don't like being frightened and disgusted. Those three assumptions, though individually intuitive, entail a contradiction together, and so we have to decide which of them is the false one. According to Lovecraft, the false one is this second assumption here. Lovecraft will admit that horror fiction does frighten and disgust its audiences, but that's not what makes it horror fiction. That's not what defines the genre. Instead, Lovecraft argues that horror fiction is defined by something which he calls cosmic fear. Not ordinary fear, but cosmic fear. And we're going to talk about what he means by this exactly. He's drawing from a tradition of aesthetics which goes back to the 19th century, or a bit before, to the era of Romanticism. Certain writers like Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant distinguish two sorts of aesthetic sensations which we indulge in when we consume art. One of them is the beautiful, and the other is the sublime. And this interests us because cosmic fear is a species of the sublime, or it's Lovecraft's way of talking about the sublime. The best way to think about the sublime is to begin with a couple of examples and a sort of sensation that often arises when you approach these examples. Have you ever looked up at a starry sky at night and thought about the vast distances between all of those stars? And how absolutely infinite the stars seem? Have you ever considered that the size of the whole planet that you're on, the whole planet Earth, is no more than a grain of sand in comparison to some of the biggest stars, and that those stars are no more than a grain of sand when considered among the galaxies that they inhabit, and that those galaxies are no more than a grain of sand in the larger expanse of galaxy clusters, and so on? And have you ever felt a little dizzy, or like you're on a ship that's tipping over, or you're about to fall off of something gigantic, like from a great height? That sort of dizziness, that sort of sense of wonder and awe, that's what the sublime is. In his discussion of the sublime in the Critique of Judgment, Kant characterized it as the apprehension of the infinite, that in the face of something vast and limitless, we experience this dizzying sensation of not being able to summarize it easily with a whole concept. There's no single concept from our experience that we can use to capture all of infinity. We know how to count, and we know how to say the word infinite, but we just can't capture what it feels like to consider the limitlessness of the stars, for instance, or the vastness of space. Other typical examples of the sublime include a vast and stormy sea, or a tornado, or a colossal storm that makes you feel small and insignificant in the face of nature's power. That would also be an example of the sublime. Anything that makes you feel a little dizzy because you're so small in comparison with its vastness, that's a sublime object. A starry sky, a stormy sea, a huge and unfathomably colossal monster. The sublime always involves something vast, and it always involves us seeming to be dwarfed by it. It could be something that's vast in size, like outer space, or a giant monster. It could be something that's vast in number, like the number of stars or the number of grains of sand on a sea. It could be something that's vast in its time or its temporal extent, like when you consider how brief of a period human beings have occupied the planet Earth. Or it could be something that's infinite in its might, like nature seems to be. Those are all objects of the sublime. It's not long after you begin discussing the sublime that eventually someone mentions that the theological is a sublime object. God, in other words, and the idea of a religious experience, where the experience of something religious makes you feel small and insignificant and makes you ponder great things. That too, at least according to Romantic philosophers, was an experience of the sublime. The beautiful, says Kant, is pleasant. Beauty is a pleasant thing to behold, if you think of a beautiful flower or a beautiful melody. But the sublime is not entirely pleasant. It shakes you up a little bit and challenges you a little bit. And yet we do enjoy it. We might not enjoy being frightened or disgusted, but we certainly enjoy the sublime in some sense. Now, according to Lovecraft, what horror fiction does is it presents a monster. And what that monster does is it challenges the idea that the universe is a safe place. It challenges the idea that you absolutely know what the universe is all about. And according to Lovecraft, it challenges the very idea that we can be secure in our scientific knowledge of the universe. Lovecraft's own monsters are written with a certain kind of alienness to them that are meant to challenge our significance. It's helpful here to draw an analogy, an extended one. Suppose that you're in your kitchen or in someone's kitchen, and you see a cockroach, and you're absolutely disgusted, and you want to destroy the cockroach or to get rid of it in some way. Now, why is it that you want to destroy the cockroach or get rid of it? Well, it's in your home, it's absolutely disgusting to you, it's contaminating your space, and therefore it's sort of a pest. But note that the cockroach cannot understand any of these things. The very ideas that you're appealing to in justifying that creature's extermination, it just cannot grasp. The idea of a house or a home, that's not just something a cockroach happens not to know about, like, oh, I've never heard of that. It's something that outstrips the cockroach's conceptual architecture. It cannot understand what that is, much less the concept of contaminating your space or a pest. It just cannot understand those things. Just can't. And yet, those concepts are wrapped up in the reason why you are squishing it, utterly destroying it. Lovecraft's monsters relate to us in the same way that we relate to that cockroach. A Lovecraftian monster like Cthulhu, probably his most famous monster, wants to destroy humanity. And it has reasons for wanting to destroy humanity. However, we can never understand those reasons. We just can't. And to even begin to try would drive us insane. In fact, merely knowing about Cthulhu is enough to drive the protagonists of that story, The Call of Cthulhu, insane. Just knowing about it. That's how Lovecraft's horror works, is he presents monsters which are so alien and so powerful that even to try to engage with them would shatter our sense of sanity and our sense of stability in the universe. And that, says Lovecraft, is what horror is really all about. That sense of being dwarfed and being rendered insignificant by something monstrous. It's a species of the sublime. And that's how Lovecraft's solution to the paradox of horror is supposed to work. That what defines horror fiction, and what attracts us to it, is not the mere sensation of being frightened or disgusted. No. We're attracted to something deeper, something romantic. we're attracted to the sublime and the sense of being jarred from our security in the world. That's how Lovecraft thinks you solve the paradox of horror. Audiences don't like being frightened and disgusted. They do like horror fiction for its distinctive genre-defining characteristic, but worry not, that distinctive genre-defining characteristic is not frightening and disgusting the audience, it's cosmic fear, which is the sublime. So, now that we've seen what Lovecraft's solution is, what might be wrong with it? Well, a couple of things. First, there are some minor differences between the usual examples of sublime objects and then the monsters of horror fiction. For one thing, a sublime object is supposed to be indescribable in some sense. And while some monsters of horror fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft's own monsters, are indescribable, that's really not true of all of them. You can easily describe Mike Myers from the Halloween series, for instance. You can easily describe the monster designed by H.R. Geiger from Alien. You can describe Freddy Krueger and Godzilla. Those creatures are not really indescribable, and since they're not indescribable, you might hesitate to characterize them as sublime. Likewise with this notion of challenging your sense of security in the world. Some monsters, again, certainly H.P. Lovecraft's monsters, will challenge our sense of security in the world. It'll challenge our assumptions that we know what's going on. The alien creatures from Tremors might tell us that there's more deep within the earth than our science might initially assume. But again, what about Mike Myers? What about Eight-Legged Freaks? What about The Strangers? What about Get Out? Though shocking and horrific, most of these horror stories do not challenge our scientific understanding of the world, or the idea that we can know the world through science. Of course, Lovecraft anticipates this sort of criticism, and will distinguish between good horror fiction and bad. Lovecraft will say, oh, sure, not all monsters are going to fill you with a sense of cosmic dread, and not all monsters are going to challenge your sense of security and scientific knowledge of the world, but the good ones will. If someone writes really good horror fiction, that's what they'll do. That's what horror fiction is supposed to do. And fair enough. But with that response, we can more easily focus on the main objection to Lovecraft's account. And that's this: that Lovecraft seems to be defining the horror genre in the same terms with which he evaluates it. And because he's doing this, we can set up a kind of dilemma for him. A dilemma, if you recall, is a set of two options, neither of which is very good. We present the dilemma like this. We ask, do all monsters from horror fiction, do all of them elicit cosmic fear? There are, of course, two possible answers. Yes, all monsters from horror fiction elicit cosmic fear, and no, not all monsters from horror fiction elicit cosmic fear. If Lovecraft takes the first horn of the dilemma, if Lovecraft says, oh, absolutely, all monsters from horror fiction elicit cosmic fear, then he faces counterexamples. What about Attack of the Killer Tomatoes? What about Beetlejuice? What about Chucky? Those aren't exactly sublime objects. How do you deal with those counterexamples? If, on the other hand, Lovecraft says, no, not all monsters elicit cosmic fear, just the good monsters, just the well-crafted monsters, in other words. Well, at that point, Lovecraft's solution to the paradox of horror would be incomplete. His solution would only apply to the good horror fiction. In other words, we would have an explanation for why audiences like good horror fiction, but we wouldn't have an explanation yet for why audiences enjoy the horror fiction that Lovecraft considers bad. If what attracts us to horror fiction is sublimity and cosmic fear, and people like going to see Attack of the Killer Tomatoes or Beetlejuice, and neither of those movies elicit cosmic fear, then we still need to know why people go and see those movies. And Lovecraft's solution won't help us. Anyway, that's a short video about the romantic solution to the paradox of horror. That's Lovecraft's solution to the paradox of horror. We've taken a look at the psychological solution involving Freud and Freudians. We've taken a look at the romantic solution involving Lovecraft and the sublime. And now we're going to move on to this content-theoretic solution to the paradox of horror, one which borrows certain ideas from Aristotle and from David Hume. Thanks for watching. See you next time.